So yeah, I broke my foot. I am going to tell you the story of how that happened. In fact, it's related, and it could even happen in your garden too. But before we get to that, what I really wanted to show you this week was my all-time favorite gardening tool. How it saves me heaps of time, it makes gardening really fun, but it's also completely changed my philosophy of raising seeds and starting a garden. Well, let me introduce you to one of my favorite tools in the greenhouse, my soil blocker. Now, if you've never seen one of these before, let me explain it really quickly. Essentially, it's a stamping or a stenciling tool that's going to squeeze out or stamp out tiny little cubes of soil just like this. And I've set this one up. We planted it a few weeks ago with a little radish plant just so you could see what it looks like when it's growing a plant in it. And now you're asking yourself the question, well, why would you grow your seedlings like that? Why not just raise them in normal plastic seed trays like everyone else has done forever? And actually, plastic is the first reason. I've got 4 really good reasons that I like to use a soil blocker over other methods of raising seedlings. And the first is I don't have to use any plastic that I'm ultimately going to end up throwing away. Now, cell trays are great. You can use them probably a few seasons, but after a while they do break through use, they get sun damage, they deteriorate, and you do have to throw them out. And as much as possible, I'm trying to limit my single use or few times use plastic. And so I do use some plastic in the process. It's a little bit unavoidable. Like for example, this food tray that we're going to set them all up on. That's a plastic food tray. I'm working at a plastic trestle table. And what else? Oh, I use plastic labels to label my plants. But all of these items are 100% reusable. In fact, all of these items I've had for more than 10 years. And so as much as possible, I'm trying to do my part to limit my single-use plastics. All right, that's reason number 1. Reason number 2, the way you water soil blocks is really interesting, and it's actually a gentle method for raising them. The way I water them is not an overhead watering system where I have to be careful of things like the droplet size of water that I'm using so that I don't disturb that tiny little seed or seedling as it's developing. Instead, I'm going to fill up rows of these soil blocks on this tray, and then I'm just going to put water in the side of this tray. So it's important that it has a lip. I'll fill that up, and this little soil block is going to soak water from the bottom to the top, and the plant's going to be able to access the water that it needs that's soaked into that soil block. So instead of picking a fine mist and trying to finely gently mist my plants and not disturb the seed or the seedling as it's growing, I don't have to worry about that at all. I'm just pouring water in the side of that tray. All right, reason number 3, the third reason that I love soil blocking is not only is it plastic free, not only is it a gentle watering method, but the way the roots develop over time, it's going to tell me, this little plant's going to tell me when it's ready to go out into the garden, when it's ready to be transplanted. And that's because plants don't like to grow their roots in the air. And so soil blocking is a way of air pruning your plants. And that is that I can see already a few tiny little fibers, a few little hairs there on the sides where the roots have reached the edge of the soil block, detected that they're in the air, and haven't grown any further. But if I look underneath it, where the soil block was up against the bottom of the tray, well, those roots have been able to go because it's dark and there's no air or sunlight there, and they've explored a little bit under the soil block. But the first indication that this plant has reached a level of maturity that tells me that it's ready to go out into the garden is that I can see those little tiny root hairs on the side of the soil block. And the last reason that I like using soil blocks over traditional plastic seed raising trays is because of Transplant Shock. And this might be the most important reason. If you've ever bought seedlings from your nursery before, you know they come in those cell trays or little punnets, and you have to take that seedling, unplug it from the tray, and take that poor little plug that's now all of a sudden got all of those roots on the side of it that get exposed to the air and exposed to the sunlight. Poor little plant got twisted and contorted in the process. Then it gets jammed into a brand new hole in the ground. From the plant's perspective, that's quite a traumatic experience. And I'm not over exaggerating. You'll know if you've ever had to do that before, a number of your plants don't survive that process. It is actually a shocking process to the plant. But from this plant's little perspective, all that happens to it is one day it was sitting nicely on this food tray. The next day it's picked up from it. It's literally sat almost just on top of my garden, maybe in a little shallow dished out area. A bit of soil gets pushed up against the sides of it, and there it is, happy in its new home. So let me tell you a number of tools that you're going to want to use if you're going to take up soil blocking. Obviously, there's your soil blocker, and we'll get into the mechanics of how that works in just a moment. Now, you could get away with just that, but you're going to need something to set your soil blocks on. And like I said before, I really like these plastic food trays. They're only a few dollars. They last years and years and years. And these ones are great because they perfectly fit 8 by 5, 40 soil blocks on them. So that's a really great way. And then all I need is a simple shelf just to kind of rack these all up on. So your soil blocker and a tray is probably all you need, but I'll run you through a few of the tools that I've developed over time in my process. All right, we're going to want some labels for labeling the plants. Now, like I said before, I do use these plastic labels. I do reuse these plastic labels. You could use paddle pop sticks, you know, like wooden ice block sticks if you want. They deteriorate in the garden, so you can kind of leave them there. Obviously, you're going to want a pen to write on your labels. One of these plasterer's tools or plasterer's knife. This is really useful because sometimes the soil blocker stamps out the blocks, and if they're a little bit too wet and soggy, they can sort of stick together a bit. And I do like the channels or the gaps between them to be a little wider, so I can get that in my rows of soil blocks and just kind of wiggle them apart a bit. That's a really useful, you know, a couple of dollars for one of those. What else? Oh, one of these large sieves. In a moment, I'm going to talk to you about the ingredients that go into this soil block. I use a really simple recipe, but if you're using topsoil or ingredients from your garden area, and that's okay, but you might want to get your material a little finer. For example, if I was to make a soil block like that and there was a big chunk of bark in there or a stick or a leaf, it does kind of mess with the integrity of the block a bit and it can fall apart. So one of these nice coarse garden sieves is a really useful tool. Speaking of sieves, I also use a finer one. This is kind of really optional, but one thing that I've learned is that I take a little sieve and sift out a nice little pile of very, very fine soil, and that's what goes on just over the top of my seed after I've planted it. Totally optional, but something I like to do. And then you're going to want the ingredients for your soil block mixture. Now, jump on Google, search soil block recipe. You will find a dozen different ideas. I'm going to simplify it for you. I use 4 simple ingredients, and the first is soil. Now, you can't just use soil from your garden. Like I said, you're probably going to want to sift it down just a little bit. You don't want to buy potting mix or seed raising mix. I mean, you could use that stuff, but number one, it's going to be more expensive over time. And number two, I don't always know what ingredients are in potting mixtures or seed raising mixtures. The stuff I'm making is 4 simple ingredients. I know exactly what's in it. And the first is a premium garden soil. So again, probably not topsoil, because topsoil, I don't know, you might get some weed seeds in it. Maybe if you're buying it from a landscape supply place, you might be all right. But a premium garden soil is number one. Number two is going to be sand. Again, I'm going to be taking this from the property here because we do have a sand deposit in the middle of the property that I can take from. But if you're buying it from the store, it's either coarse sand or propagating sand, it might be known as. So soil, sand, I want something to soak up the water. And so that's where I'm using peat moss. Now, peat moss, or you could use coconut coir as well. Peat moss is a fuzzy substance that soaks up water. And so I want that in the mixture as well. And then this, you might have seen this before. If you've bought seedlings before, you might have seen this stuff like sort of on the top and gone, is that polystyrene? Why are they using polystyrene on the... No, it's not. It's actually a volcanic material called perlite. And if you were to look at perlite under a microscope, it has a network of thousands upon thousands of tiny little holes all throughout it, which have the ability to take up water and hold onto and hang onto water. So each one of those tiny little pebbles is a massive water reservoir for your soil block. So again, you can get that from your garden supply place. 4 simple ingredients, and the way you remember the recipe is 4 to 1 to 1 to 1. 4 parts premium garden soil to 1 part sand, 1 part peat moss, and 1 part perlite. Now, it doesn't matter what measuring tool you're using. You might be using like a garden pot. I'd get 4 scoops of that premium garden soil in there. I'd get 1 of sand, 1 of perlite, 1 of peat moss, and then I'm going to blend it all together. I just use my hands. You're going to see in a moment. It's a really messy but kind of fun experience, and then I'm going to blend all that together nicely. Now, while it's dry is when I blend it, because then actually the 5th ingredient is water. We're going to add water to the whole thing, and I'll explain how that works in a moment. In fact, I'm going to show you it. We're going to make up a batch of it right now. Oh, one more tool that might be handy. I find these flexi tubs, and in fact I've already got some material in there, but I find these big flexi tubs are great. One of these about half filled does me probably about 4 of these trays worth of soil blocks. So again, another tool you could add to the list. All right, let's make up a batch. So this is my soil sand mixture. So remember, I've got 4 parts premium soil to 1 part sand. I've sifted that into here so that I don't have any big chunks of clay or other material. Like the soil I did actually get from our ground, so I didn't want big chunks of organic material like bark or roots or leaves or anything like that in there. So that's a nice fine mixture. So to it, we're going to be adding 1 part peat moss. Now obviously you can see I'm not measuring this in, and that is because I've done this for a while now. I know how much to mix into this. And then I'm going to be adding 1 part perlite. So once I've got all my ingredients in here, and like I said, these are the dry ingredients, so I'm not adding water at this stage. I'm blending this up. Okay, so I'm only going to tip out a little bit at a time, and I'm estimating about how much I'll use for 1 tray of soil blocks. Now, here's the fun part. I want you to make a volcano. Come on, you remember your childhood. All right. And the reason for that is this is probably going to be the least messy way of doing the water, but look, just don't wear your good clothes. There's unavoidable mess incoming. Little tip, always have your hose, if you've got a different settings on your hose, always have it set to shower when you're in your greenhouse. You don't want this thing on full jet when you open it up in here. All right, you fill up your little crater there, and we're just going to start on the outside and try not to let that water go everywhere. We're going to start blending it in. All right. So here's what I'm looking for. As I'm doing this, so here's what I'm looking for. I am looking for the consistency of a good old-fashioned mud ball. Now that I've grabbed right from the middle, and I can tell already I'm going to need to add more to the outside here. It's still too dry. But I'll know I've got that consistency right when I can form a shape like a ball. It stays in shape, but I can break it apart. And I do mean break. Notice I just was able to pull that apart in a nice even break. It didn't slosh apart. It's not trying to smush back down into my hand of its own accord. So I've got a good amount of water there, but not out here. So I know I'm going to need to add a little bit more. And the reason you hold back some of your material in your tub or in your bucket that you're using is if you've gone too far with the water, you can always add a bit of dry material into it as well. But you get used to this over time and you can eyeball it after a while. All right, I told you this would be fun and I told you this would be messy. What I didn't tell you is that it's going to bring out your inner child. All right, little consistency check. Oh, that's a nice looking mud ball. Does it pull apart? Ooh, it's feeling a little bit wet. I could always add a little bit more dry material to it, but I reckon we're pretty close. Okay, so I'm going to get that together into a nice pile like that. Now, you're also going to want to be able to work with your tray up close. So that's where my soil blocks are going to end up. And I'm going to show you the technique of how we use the soil blocker tool. So the basics of it is I need to fill each of these 4 cavities packed full of this soil block mixture, and I need it compressed in there. So the first thing I want to make sure is that my mound that I'm pushing into is actually taller than this part of my soil blocker. So I'm going to pull that up a little bit higher. And then I'm just going to push the whole tool down until I feel the table below. Now, this is a reason that I like to have a flat plastic surface, is because the next thing is to make sure we get a flat bottom on the soil blocker. And so just smushing it into your table there will give you that nice flat surface on the bottom of the soil blocker. You're going to find that the material stays in there even if I hold it upside down, and this is the point where we transfer it out onto the tray. So I'm putting it down in position where I want it to go. I know these trays, I can get 2 of these in a row and I can get 5 rows. I end up with 40 soil blocks to a plastic food tray. Here's the technique. The palm of your hand goes on the handle and your fingers wrap around that next section there. Now, if you think about this tool in 2 parts, there's the handle connected to this plate, the back plate here, and it has these feet that are sitting on top of your soil blocks. So the handle and plate stay in place. The outer frame, which is this bit here and this bit here, is going to pull up from the soil blocker. So palm of your hand on the handle, fingers wrap around the top section, and I'm pulling up the outer frame. Just like that. All right, so Kirsty's going to be putting some seeds into the soil blocks, and one of the things you might have noticed is the soil blocker has these little plugs underneath. Now, in fact, it comes with a range of different size plugs that you can use. You can even get square ones that suit the mini soil blocker, so look that up, that's a really cool idea. But we just use the medium-sized dome-shaped plug, and it makes this sort of 5 to 10 millimeter deep rounded hole, and that's what your seed's going to go into. And then what I'm making over here, just using my little kitchen sieve, yep, I did steal this from the kitchen, is a fine material, like really ultra fine, that's going to go just on top of the seed. And ultimately the idea is this will soak up moisture from the soil block itself when we water them, and also because they're a little bit damp right now. But you just need a pinch of this in on top of that seed, and you don't even really need to press it down all that much. A pinch is just enough to cover that seed. If it's a slightly bigger seed, like say for example, I'm trying to think of a big seed that you might do in a soil block. Beetroot, I mean beetroot I'd normally start in the garden, but that's okay. Say you decided to do a beetroot seed, you might go 2 pinches. All I'm saying is the amount of material that you put on top of your seed is roughly equivalent to the thickness of the seed itself. Okay, so once it's ready, which like I said, the roots tells you that it's ready. Once I can see the roots, I know it's ready for transplant, and so I'm just pulling back some of my mulch. Use a heavy mulch on your garden beds. Keeps that moisture locked in. I'm digging a tiny little hole just to the depth of the soil block, popping it in, pushing that soil back in close, pushing that mulch around it, giving it a little bit of shelter while it adjusts to its new life out here in the garden. All right, so you want to know how I broke my foot? Well, you're a macabre bunch, aren't you? I'll tell you the story, but like most bone-breaking stories, it's not a very impressive bone, and it wasn't a very cool story. And I'll give you the ending right now. It was that rock right there that took me out. But I want to tell you what I was up to at the time because it's relevant. So I'm sitting right in the middle of our gardens area, and I'm sitting on a really large tree that we just felled. And the reason for that is we picked this area to start and establish our homestead gardens on. Number one, because it was already a relatively clear area. It had a nice gentle gradient to it, but its proximity to the tiny home, which is just behind me over there. Now, what we've discovered over the winter months is that some of these trees in the north side here, so we're southern hemisphere, as that low winter sun was tracking across the sky, they were casting big, huge shadows right into this area. Look around the property, we have thousands of trees, we can afford to lose a few, and so we decided that this row of trees needed to go, and so we needed to drop this tree, and that was going to clear the area. Our goal is to create a full production homestead garden and get our grocery bill as close to zero as we possibly can. Now, I was a little bit nervous about this tree. I've got plenty of experience felling trees. I know what I'm doing. We always take all the safety precautions, but this one was large, and the greenhouse is there, JJ's cabin's there, the shed's right there, the tiny home's right there, all within distance if this tree didn't fall right. But it did. It landed exactly where I wanted it to go. And long story short about what happened to my foot is I said I wanted the top of the tree to hit the compost pile. Bam, it landed right on top of, or just brushed the compost pile, exactly where I wanted it to go. I immediately jumped up on the log afterwards to brag about it, and then when I jumped down, that's when I didn't see the rock. And I kind of point that out because it's such an inane activity that I, kind of jumped off of a log onto the ground and just didn't see where I was going. And I should know better because we've got rocks everywhere. One of the things we're dealing with on this property is the amount of rocks we've got to dig out of the ground. We're getting a nice collection actually, and that's going to go into some of our landscaping projects. But I point that out to say, look, you can know everything that you're doing with a particular task. You can be safety trained on a task and you just don't pay attention, a slight lapse in judgment, and you can really hurt yourself. So be careful out there. Now, I wanted to point out what we're doing in this gardens area because this is a really large project. We're about halfway into establishing a whole bunch of garden beds. We've got our greenhouse set up. We've just spent the last few days in there soil blocking and setting a whole bunch of seedlings going. We've got big plans for this area, but that's what we're up to at the moment. The great news is the hospital just gave me a call yesterday and they said, we want you straight out of the cast and straight straight into a moon boot. We want you walking around on it because apparently that's the best method for this particular bone. It's my 5th metatarsal apparently, for how it heals. So we thought we might be out of action for, you know, 2-3 months, and we've got stacks of projects lined up, all that we wanted to film and show you. We might not get them all done. We're a little limited in our capacity now, but we'll get some things done, and that's great because we're heading into the warmer months. We've got so many plans for this area and for our entire homestead. So that's what's happening, and that's the story of how I broke my foot. We'll see you on the next video.